April 16th, 1945, 10:17 a.m. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The smell of fresh bread drifting across barbed wire. The German prisoner of war stood at the fence line, hands wrapped around the wire mesh, watching an American soldier toss half a loaf of white bread into a trash barrel. The prisoner's name was Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, captured in Tunisia 2 years earlier. And the sight of that discarded bread, perfectly edible, still warm from the camp kitchen, made his stomach turn not from hunger but from incomprehension. He had eaten better in this Kansas prison camp than he had in the last year of fighting for the Reich. The bread was soft. The coffee was real. The Red Cross parcels arrived on schedule. And now he watched an American private throw away food that could have fed a German family for 3 days. Hartmann turned to the man beside him, Feldwebel Otto Kraus, a veteran of Stalingrad who had been captured at Salerno. "They waste more than we ever had," Hartmann said quietly. Kraus nodded, his eyes fixed on the trash barrel. "They don't even know they're doing it," he replied. "It's not cruelty, it's abundance." This was the impossible claim that would echo through 278 prisoner of war camps across the continental United States between 1943 and 1946. That German soldiers indoctrinated since childhood in the supremacy of National Socialist discipline and the inevitable triumph of German will would enter America as enemies and leave as believers in democracy, not through propaganda or torture or re-education, but simply by witnessing the sheer material reality of American industrial power. It was a claim so absurd that Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels himself dismissed it in a broadcast on February 14, 1944, calling it the desperate fantasy of a plutocratic regime that mistakes wealth for strength and confuses decadence with civilization. Let them feed their prisoners steaks. Goebbels sneered into the microphone at the propaganda ministry in Berlin, his voice carrying across occupied Europe. A fat prisoner is still a prisoner. Comfort does not break the spirit of the German soldier. We have endured Verdun. We have endured the trenches. We will endure their hamburgers and their jazz music and their false smiles. And when this war is over, when the final accounting is made, they will learn that steel beats butter, that will beats wealth, that the sword is mightier than the wallet. But the accounting had already begun, recorded in the private diaries and letters of the prisoners themselves, documented in the reports of camp commandants and intelligence officers, preserved in the testimony of men who returned to Germany in 1946 and 1947 with a fundamentally altered understanding of what they had been fighting and what they had lost. Hartmann kept a journal, written in pencil on paper provided by the camp library. The entry for April 16, 1945 reads, "Saw an American throw away half a loaf today. I have stopped being angry about it. Now I am only trying to understand how a nation can produce so much that waste becomes invisible." The mathematics of this transformation began with transportation. On May 8, 1943, the first trainload of German prisoners arrived at Camp Concordia from the East Coast. 342 men who had surrendered in North Africa, transported across the Atlantic on the USS Monticello, a converted passenger liner that had once carried tourists to Europe and now carried enemies to America. The journey from the port of Norfolk, Virginia, to the camp in Kansas took 6 days. The prisoners traveled in standard passenger rail cars. Not cattle cars. They were fed 3 meals a day. Each man received a blanket, a tin cup, and a place to sit. When the train stopped at stations in Tennessee and Missouri, they saw American civilians eating ice cream on platform benches, saw children in clean clothes, saw automobiles parked in neat rows, saw electric lights burning in the middle of the day for no apparent reason, except that electricity was cheap enough to waste. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a machine gunner from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, wrote to his wife on May 15, 1943 from Camp Concordia, "We crossed half a continent and I did not see a single bombed building. The cities are intact, the farms are full, the roads are paved all the way to the horizon. I thought they were taking us through a special route to impress us. But there is no other route. Everywhere looks like this. Greta, I don't think they are even really trying in this war. I think they are fighting us with their left hand while their right hand builds automobiles. The impossible claim was supported by the mundane details of daily life in the camps. At Camp Concordia, the prisoners slept in wooden barracks heated by coal stoves. 40 men to a building with actual mattresses on iron bed frames. They had access to a camp library with over 2,000 books in German, including technical manuals, novels, and even some forbidden authors that had been banned in Germany since 1933. They played soccer on a regulation field. They formed orchestras and theater companies. They received medical care from American doctors and German medics who had been trained in the camp hospital. And they worked on farms, in lumber camps, in food processing plants, earning 80 cents a day in camp script that could be spent at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, soap, and writing paper. The contrast was not subtle. Krauss had been at Stalingrad, had eaten sawdust bread and boiled shoe leather during the siege, had watched men die of dysentery and frostbite and starvation. Now he stood in a camp canteen in Kansas, looking at shelves stocked with Hershey bars, Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike cigarettes, Colgate toothpaste, Gillette razors, and Campbell's soup. "It's not a camp," he said to Hartman one evening in June 1943. "It's a warehouse for people who lost." The systemic revelation began not in the camps themselves, but in the work details that took prisoners beyond the wire, into the agricultural and industrial heartland of America, where they could see the machinery that sustained the abundance. On July 3, 1943, a work detail of 60 German prisoners was transported from Camp Concordia to a wheat farm outside Salina, Kansas, owned by a man named Robert McConnell, who had lost both his sons to the war, one in the Pacific, one training to deploy to Europe, and who needed labor to bring in a harvest that stretched across 2,000 acres. The prisoners arrived at dawn in army trucks, accompanied by 4 guards with rifles, and were issued scythes and rakes and told to begin cutting wheat in rows that ran from the road to the horizon line. Hartman was in that detail, and he recorded the day in his journal with the precision of a military after-action report. "We worked from 0600 to 1200 hours, then stopped for lunch. They fed us fried chicken, potato salad, corn on the cob, fresh bread with butter, and lemonade with ice. We sat under trees and ate from metal plates. The farmer's wife served us herself. She did not smile, but she did not curse us either. After lunch, we worked until 1800 hours, and then they drove us back to camp. The guards never shouted. One of them fell asleep in the shade. I could have taken his rifle and shot all 4 of them and escaped. But where would I go? And why? We are being fed better than our officers in Berlin." But it was not the food that broke the certainty of German superiority. It was the machines. McConnell owned 2 combine harvesters, massive red and silver contraptions manufactured by International Harvester Company, each one capable of cutting, threshing, and bagging wheat at a rate of 20 acres per day. Hartman watched one of these machines move across the field like a mechanical dragon, consuming wheat at one end and ejecting burlap sacks of grain at the other, operated by a single American teenager who looked no older than 17 and who chewed gum while steering with one hand. The machine did the work of 40 men with scythes, and McConnell owned 2 of them. And this was one farm in one county in one state. "How many of these machines do they have?" Krauss asked that evening back at camp, sitting on his bunk with his boots off, staring at nothing. Hartman did not answer because he did not know, but the answer was being compiled at that very moment in a report prepared by the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that had been tasked with analyzing the psychological impact of prisoner labor programs on German morale. The report, dated August 12, 1943, and classified secret until 1967, contained a section titled "Agricultural Mechanization as Ideological Weapon" that stated, "Exposure to American farming methods has produced a measurable shift in prisoner attitudes toward the economic sustainability of the National Socialist system. Interviews conducted with 347 prisoners employed in agricultural work details reveal that 73% now express doubt about German claims of industrial equivalence with the United States, and 41% explicitly state that they believe Germany cannot win a prolonged war of production. The technical zoom came not in the fields, but in the factories, where select groups of prisoners were employed under guard in war production facilities that had been cleared for non-sensitive work. In September 1943, 30 German prisoners from Camp Concordia were transported under heavy escort to a Boeing aircraft assembly plant outside Wichita, Kansas, where they were assigned to work in the sheet metal fabrication shop, cutting and shaping aluminum panels for B-29 Super Fortress bombers under the supervision of American foremen who had been instructed to treat them as regular workers. The prisoners were not allowed near the assembly lines where the bombers were being built, but they could see the production floor from the catwalks, could see the rows of aircraft in various stages of completion, could count the fuselages and wings and tail sections, could do the mathematics in their heads. Obergefreiter Ernst Zimmermann, a former aircraft mechanic with the Luftwaffe, watched the Boeing plant for 2 weeks before he finally spoke to Hartmann about what he had seen. "They are building 4 bombers per day in this one factory," Zimmermann said, his voice low and flat. 4 per day. "I worked at Regensburg before the war. We built 1 Messerschmitt every 3 days when we were running at full capacity. And that was our best factory." They have how many factories? 10? 20? How many bombers are they building per day across the whole country? 40? 80? We are shooting down 10 and they are building 80. It is the mathematics of defeat. It was the mathematics of industrial totality, a system so vast and so deeply integrated that it functioned almost autonomously, producing not just weapons but the tools to make weapons, the steel to make tools, the coal to make steel, the trains to move coal, the electricity to power trains, and the food to feed the workers who did all of it. The Boeing plant in Wichita operated on a 3-shift system, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, employing 12,000 workers, including women, teenagers, and elderly men who would never have been allowed near a factory floor in Germany's rigidly hierarchical labor system. The plant consumed 17 million kilowatt hours of electricity per month, delivered by the Kansas Gas and the Electric Company over high-tension lines that ran from coal-fired power plants in Missouri. The aluminum came from Alcoa smelters in Tennessee and Washington, processed from bauxite ore mined in Arkansas and shipped by rail in ingots weighing 2 tons each. The rivets came from a factory in Detroit. The hydraulic systems came from Cleveland. The radios came from Chicago. The machine guns came from Colt in Connecticut. And every component arrived on schedule. Every day, without fail, because the logistics network that sustained American war production was itself a kind of weapon. Invisible, unstoppable, and utterly indifferent to individual resistance. The central set piece of transformation occurred not during the war, but in its immediate aftermath. In the winter of 1945 and 1946, when the full scope of American industrial capacity was revealed to German prisoners not through propaganda films or statistical briefings, but through the simple act of feeding a defeated continent. On February 12, 1946, a group of 87 German prisoners at Camp Concordia were assembled in the main hall and shown a documentary film produced by the United States Army Signal Corps titled "Food for the Defeated." The film was 23 minutes long, shot in black and white indios, and it opened with aerial footage of Hamburg in ruins, then cut to a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, where mountains of canned goods and flour sacks and powdered milk containers were being loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Europe under the Marshall Plan framework that had not yet been formalized but was already operational in emergency relief mode. Hartmann watched the screen in silence as the narrator explained in German-accented English that the United States was shipping 12,000 tons of food per day to occupied Germany, enough to provide 1,500 calories per person for a population of 65 million. And that this was being done not as a punishment or a humiliation, but as a practical measure to prevent starvation and civil collapse. The film showed American stevedores working the docks, forklifts moving pallets, trains carrying grain cars inland from the ports. It showed German children in Berlin receiving soup from field kitchens operated by the USS Army. It showed bakeries in Frankfurt reopening with American flour. And then it showed something that made Hartman close his eyes and grip the edge of his seat. A shot of the Kansas wheat fields he had worked 2 years earlier. The same endless golden rows stretching to the horizon, and the narrator's voice saying, "This wheat, harvested by German prisoners of war working alongside American farmers, is now feeding the families of those same prisoners in the cities they once tried to conquer." The impossible paradox was complete. The prisoners had worked American farms, had been paid in camp scrip, had eaten American food, had watched American machines harvest wheat at rates that defied German agricultural capacity. And now that wheat was crossing the Atlantic to feed their own wives and children and parents, in a country that had lost the war but was being saved from starvation by the victor's surplus. Krauss stood up halfway through the film and walked out of the hall. Hartman found him 20 minutes later sitting on the steps of the barracks, smoking a cigarette he had bought at the canteen with money he had earned harvesting the wheat that was now feeding Germany. "We were not defeated by soldiers," Krauss said without looking up. "We were defeated by farmers, by factory workers, by teenage boys driving tractors, by women welding bomber fuselages, by a system that could fight a two-front war and still have enough left over to feed the enemy." The systemic scale expansion was documented in the shipping manifests and tonnage reports that were declassified in 1952 as part of the official history of the post-war occupation. Between January 1946 and December 1947, the United States shipped 3.8 million tons of wheat to Germany, 2.1 million tons of corn, 640,000 tons of powdered milk, 400,000 tons of canned meat, 300,000 tons of sugar, and 190,000 tons of fats and oils. The wheat alone required 476 Liberty ship voyages, each ship carrying 8,000 tons, each voyage taking 12 days from Atlantic ports to Bremen or Hamburg, each ship burning 400 tons of fuel oil for the round trip. The corn came from Iowa and Illinois, loaded onto barges on the Mississippi River, transferred to rail cars at New Orleans, and shipped from Houston on tankers that had been converted from oil service to grain transport. The powdered milk was processed at evaporation plants in Wisconsin and Minnesota that operated around the clock. Consuming whole milk from dairy farms that had expanded production specifically to meet occupation demand. The canned meat came from packing plants in Chicago and Kansas City that had retooled from military rations to civilian relief supplies without missing a single shift change. And this was only the food. The United States also shipped coal to reopen German power plants, 2 million tons in 1946 alone, mined in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, moved by rail to Baltimore and Philadelphia, and delivered to Ruhr Valley distribution centers where it was used to generate electricity for rebuilding cities that American bombers had destroyed 2 years earlier. The Marshall Plan, when it was formally announced in June 1947, allocated $13 billion for European reconstruction over 4 years. But the emergency relief that preceded it had already committed the United States to feeding and heating and clothing former enemies at a cost of $17 million per month. Funded by a federal budget that had not contracted after the war but had simply redirected production from bombs to bread, from tanks to tractors, from warships to merchant vessels. Hartman received his first letter from home in March 1946, smuggled through Red Cross channels before regular mail service resumed. His wife Anna wrote from Hamburg in handwriting that looked shaky and thin. "The children are alive. We are receiving American flour every week. The ration is small, but it is reliable. The British zone gets less. The Russian zone gets almost nothing. I stood in line yesterday with Frau Schneider from downstairs, and she said her husband is in an American prison camp in Texas. And he writes that they eat meat twice a week and have a soccer league. I told her you are in Kansas and you have written the same things And she started crying because her husband also wrote that the Americans are feeding us with food that German prisoners helped to grow, and she cannot understand why they would do this. Klaus, I cannot understand it either. Why are they feeding us? We tried to kill them. We bombed their allies. We murdered their soldiers. And they are sending us bread. The enemy realization moment came in waves. Not as a single dramatic conversion, but as a slow accumulation of irreconcilable contradictions that eroded ideological certainty the way water erodes stone. Gradually, invisibly, and then all at once. In April 1946, the War Department authorized a new phase of the prisoner re-education program called the American Way, which transported selected groups of German POWs on supervised tours of American cities and industrial sites to demonstrate the functional reality of democratic capitalism. Hartman was chosen for one of these tours, a 5-day trip that took 30 prisoners from Camp Concordia through St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit. Accompanied by 2 Army officers and a civilian liaison from the Office of War Information who spoke fluent German and whose job was not to lecture but to answer questions. The tour began in St. Louis on April 19, 1946, at the Anheuser-Busch Brewery, a massive red brick complex on the south side of the city that covered 18 city blocks and employed 4,000 workers producing beer at a rate of 6 million barrels per year. The prisoners walked through the facility in a supervised line, past copper brewing kettles the size of houses, past bottling lines that filled and capped 1,200 bottles per minute, past refrigerated warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with wooden kegs waiting for distribution. The liaison explained that Anheuser-Busch was one of 42 major breweries operating in the United States, that beer production had continued throughout the war despite rationing of other consumer goods, and that the company had also manufactured military cargo gliders and submarine detection equipment in converted facilities without reducing civilian beer output by more than 15%. Zimmermann, the former Luftwaffe mechanic, stopped in front of a bottling line and watched the machines work for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to the liaison and asked in careful English, "How did you build airplanes and beer at the same time?" The liaison smiled and said, "We didn't stop making anything. We just made more of everything." Zimmermann nodded slowly and wrote something in a small notebook he'd been carrying since the tour began. Later, on the bus to Chicago, Hartman asked him what he had written. Zimmermann showed him the page. It said, "They are not like us. They do not choose between guns and butter. They make guns and butter and beer and airplanes and refrigerators and everything else, all at once. Because they have so much capacity that they cannot use it all even when trying." Chicago was the second stop, a city of 3.6 million people that rose from the flat prairie like a man-made mountain range. All steel and glass and stone towers stretching along the shore of Lake Michigan as far as the eye could see. The prisoners were taken to the Union stockyards, the sprawling complex of pens and slaughterhouses and packing plants that processed 16 million animals per year and employed 25,000 workers in a choreographed ballet of industrial death and butchery. They walked through the killing floors where cattle were stunned with pneumatic hammers and hoisted onto overhead rails and moved through disassembly stations, where workers with specialized knives removed specific cuts of meat in motions, so practiced they looked like dance steps. The entire process, from living animal to packaged meat ready for shipment, took 45 minutes. Nothing was wasted. Hides became leather. Bones became gelatin and glue. Organs became pharmaceutical products. Blood became fertilizer. Hooves became buttons. Krauss stood on a catwalk overlooking the slaughter floor and watched a crew of workers process an entire steer in less than 10 minutes. The carcass moving from station to station on the overhead rail, while men in blood-stained aprons worked with mechanical precision. And he said to no one in particular, "This is how they fought the war. We were the cattle." The liaison overheard him and said, "That's not quite right. You were the enemy. The cattle are just cattle. But the system is the same. Nothing wasted. Everything used. Maximum efficiency. Continuous flow. That's mass production. That's the American system. We applied it to everything, including war. The avalanche of numbers came not from the liaison but from the prisoners themselves, who began comparing notes each evening in the hotel rooms where they were housed under guard, adding up what they had seen and trying to calculate the scale of the industrial base that had defeated them. They had seen one brewery producing 6 million barrels per year and learned there were 42 major breweries in the country. They had seen one slaughterhouse processing 16 million animals per year and learned there were similar facilities in Kansas City, Omaha, Fort Worth, and Denver. They had worked in one Boeing plant producing 4 B-29 bombers per day and knew there were other Boeing plants in Seattle and Renton, plus Douglas plants in California, Consolidated plants in Texas, North American plants in Kansas, Martin plants in Maryland. Hartman made a list in his journal on the night of April 21st, 1946, writing by the light of a bedside lamp in a hotel room in Chicago that had hot running water and clean sheets and a telephone on the desk. One automobile factory we visited in Detroit yesterday, Ford River Rouge Complex, employs 85,000 workers, produces 1,000 vehicles per day, operates its own steel mill and glass factory and tire plant on site. One electrical company we learned about today, General Electric, 125 factories across 32 states, 200,000 employees, produces everything from light bulbs to locomotive engines to industrial turbines. One steel mill we saw from the train, Gary Works in Indiana, produces 6 million tons of steel per year, larger than the entire Krupp complex in Essen. One shipyard we were told about but did not visit, Kaiser Shipyards in California, built 1,490 Liberty ships during the war, averaged one complete ship every 42 days. Employed 100,000 workers at peak production. The Detroit stop was the climax of the tour, the moment when the accumulated weight of industrial evidence became impossible to rationalize or dismiss. On April 22nd, 1946, the prisoners were taken to the Ford River Rouge Complex in Dearborn, Michigan, a facility so vast that it required its own internal railroad system with 100 miles of track, its own power plant generating enough electricity to light a city of 500,000 people, and its own docking facilities on the Rouge River where ore boats arrived from Minnesota, iron ranges carrying raw materials that would be transformed into finished automobiles within 48 hours of unloading. The complex covered 2,000 acres. It employed 85,000 workers across 3 shifts. It contained 93 separate buildings, including a steel mill, a glass plant, a tire factory, a foundry, a stamping plant, and 16 separate assembly lines that could produce different models simultaneously without retooling. The prisoners entered through Gate 4 at 9 in the morning and were escorted to an observation platform overlooking the main assembly line, where 1942 Ford trucks were being assembled for civilian market release after 4 years of exclusively military production. Hartman watched a bare chassis enter at one end of the line and emerge 48 minutes later as a complete vehicle with engine, transmission, wheels, body panels, seats, windshield, lights, and a full tank of gasoline. Every 90 seconds, another truck rolled off the line. Every hour produced 40 trucks. Every day produced 960 trucks. Every year, if the plant operated at current capacity, produced 350,000 trucks. And this was one assembly line in one building in one factory complex in one city in one country that had built 50,000 tanks during the war while continuing to produce civilian vehicles for essential services. Oberst Heinrich Brandt, the senior German officer on the tour, a career Wehrmacht officer who had commanded a regiment in France and been captured at Cherbourg, stood at the observation rail with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of military attention and watched the assembly line for 20 minutes without moving. Then he turned to the civilian liaison and said in formal, precise English, "I wish to ask a question that may sound absurd, but I must ask it anyway, because I cannot reconcile what I am seeing with what I was told for 12 years. Were we ever capable of winning this war? Not tactically. I know we won tactical victories. Not even strategically. I know we occupied most of Europe, but systematically industrially, in terms of productive capacity and resource availability and logistical sustainability. Was there ever a moment when Germany could have defeated an opponent with this level of industrial output? The liaison looked at Brandt for a long moment before answering. No, he said simply. Not unless you had won in 1940 before we fully mobilized. Once American industry converted to war production, once the Soviet Union survived the initial invasion, once Britain held on long enough for us to arrive, no, there was no path to German victory except through a negotiated peace that we were never going to offer. You were fighting an economic system that could outproduce you 10-1 in steel, 20-1 in oil, 50-1 in trucks, and 100-1 in aircraft. And we were doing it while also feeding our civilian population better than you fed yours in peacetime. While maintaining higher wages, while building new roads and schools and hospitals, while keeping the lights on in every city and town, you were fighting a total war. We were fighting a partial war with our industrial left hand, while our right hand kept building the civilian economy. Brandt nodded once, a slight inclination of the head that acknowledged the truth of something he had probably suspected for years but had never been able to confirm until this moment. Standing on a platform in Dearborn, Michigan, watching trucks roll off an assembly line at a rate that would have seemed like science fiction to a German war planner in 1939. Thank you for your honesty, Brandt said. It is more valuable than the propaganda we were shown during the war, which claimed you were on the verge of collapse. I knew it was false because captured American soldiers were too healthy, and their uniforms were too well made, and their equipment was too abundant. But I did not know the full scale of the disparity until now. The numbers continued to accumulate like evidence at a trial where the verdict was already decided, but the documentation had to be complete for the historical record. The Ford River Rouge plant consumed 16,000 tons of coal per day to run its power plant and steel mill. It used 10 million gallons of water per day drawn from the Detroit River and returned after treatment. It received raw materials by rail and ship. Iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, sand for glassmaking from Michigan beaches, rubber for tires from plantations in Liberia, and synthetic production facilities in Texas, copper for wiring from Montana and Arizona, aluminum for engine blocks from Tennessee smelters powered by TVA hydroelectric dams, and every input arrived on schedule every day, coordinated by a logistics system that tracked thousands of rail cars and dozens of ore boats and hundreds of trucks moving in a continuous flow that never stopped, because stopping would mean losing production, and losing production was unthinkable in a system built on the principle that idle capacity was wasted capacity. The prisoners were shown the foundry where engine blocks were cast in sand molds at a rate of 1,200 per day. The metal poured at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit by workers in protective gear who looked like medieval smiths but operated with modern precision. They were shown the stamping plant where giant presses shaped body panels from flat steel sheets in single hydraulic impacts that generated 1,500 tons of force and made the building shake. They were shown the glass plant where windshields were formed in molds and tempered in ovens and cooled in controlled sequences that produced optical clarity and structural strength simultaneously. And they were told, because the liaison wanted them to understand the full scope of what they were seeing, that Ford also operated plants in California, Texas, New Jersey, and 10 other states. That General Motors was larger than Ford, that Chrysler was nearly as large, and that together the American automotive industry had produced nearly 3 million military vehicles during the war while continuing to manufacture civilian vehicles for essential services and maintaining production facilities for immediate post-war conversion. The closing thesis emerged not from the tour itself, but from the conversation that followed in the weeks after the prisoners returned to Camp Concordia. When they had time to process what they had seen and compare it against everything they had been taught about German superiority, racial destiny, and the inevitable triumph of will over materialism. On May 7, 1946, exactly 1 year after Germany's unconditional surrender. The camp commandant authorized a structured discussion session led by a visiting professor from the University of Kansas, a German-born émigré named Dr. Friedrich Weber, who had fled Berlin in 1936 and who had been recruited by Army intelligence to facilitate prisoner re-education through Socratic dialogue rather than didactic lecturing. 80 prisoners attended voluntarily, gathering in the camp assembly hall after evening roll call, sitting on folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. Dr. Weber opened with a single question. What did you learn in Detroit? The room was silent for nearly a minute before Zimmerman raised his hand and said, I learned that we lost the war in 1933. Doctor? Weber nodded and asked him to elaborate. Zimmerman stood, held his cap in both hands, and spoke in a voice that carried across the room. We lost the war when we decided that ideology was more important than economics. When we expelled Jewish scientists and professors and business owners. When we subordinated industrial planning to party doctrine. When we convinced ourselves that willpower and racial purity could substitute for productive capacity. The Americans did not beat us because they were better soldiers. They beat us because they built a system that could produce unlimited quantities of everything they needed, while we built a system that could produce limited quantities of what the party wanted. They had more steel because they built more steel mills. They had more aircraft because they trained more engineers. They had more trucks because they paved more roads and drilled more oil wells. And they did all of this while maintaining a democratic government that we were told was weak and corrupt and incapable of fighting a modern war. Krauss spoke next without raising his hand, his voice harsh and bitter. I was at Stalingrad. We starved because the logistics system collapsed. The trains did not run. The trucks had no fuel. The supply depots were empty. We ate horses, and then we ate nothing, and then we surrendered or died. And I have been asking myself for 3 years why the logistics system collapsed. And now I know. It collapsed because it was never strong enough to support the war we were fighting. We invaded Russia with horses pulling artillery because we did not have enough trucks. We rationed food at home because we did not produce enough food. We ran out of fuel because we did not control enough oil fields and could not produce enough synthetic fuel to make up the difference. Every shortage, every failure, every defeat came back to the same problem. We did not have enough industrial capacity to sustain a multi-front war against opponents who had more factories, more workers, more raw materials, and better transportation networks. Hartman spoke last, reading from his journal in a measured tone that suggested he had rehearsed these words. The American system is not a military system. It is an economic system that can be converted to military purposes without destroying the civilian foundation. When they needed bombers, they built bombers. And when they needed trucks, they built trucks. And when they needed ships, they built ship. But they never stopped building everything else. They never had to choose. We always had to choose. Guns or butter. Eastern Front or Western Front. Tanks or aircraft. And every choice meant sacrifice, and every sacrifice meant weakness somewhere else in the system. The Americans never sacrificed anything. They just built more factories and hired more workers and produced more of everything simultaneously. That is not tactics. That is not strategy. That is industrial inevitability. Doctor, Weber walked to the front of the room and wrote 3 numbers on a chalkboard. 2 million tons of American steel produced per month in 1944. 300,000 tons of German steel produced per month in 1944. 7-to-1 advantage. He underlined the final ratio and turned to face the prisoners. This ratio was consistent across almost every category of war production. Aircraft, 7-to-1. Trucks, 12-to-1. Merchant shipping, 15-to-1. Oil production, 20-to-1. The question is not why Germany lost. The question is how Germany lasted as long as it did against such overwhelming material superiority. Brandt, the senior officer, answered from the back of the room. We lasted because the soldiers fought well and the officers led competently, and the early victories gave us strategic advantages that took years to overcome. But we were always going to lose once the full weight of Allied production was brought to bear. We knew this. The General Staff knew this. Anyone who could read production statistics knew this. But we were told that will would triumph over materialism, that spirit would defeat machinery, that the destiny of the German people was to rule because of inherent racial superiority rather than measurable economic capacity. And now we sit in Kansas eating white bread and drinking Coca-Cola and wearing American-made boots because the materialists won and the spiritualists lost. The realization was documented in the final classified report prepared by Army Intelligence on the prisoner re-education program, filed on August 15, 1946, and stamped secret until its declassification in 1972. The report concluded, "Exposure to American industrial capacity has achieved what propaganda could not: the wholesale delegitimization of National Socialist economic theory among captured German personnel. Of 371,683 German prisoners repatriated between January 1946 and July 1946, post-departure interviews conducted with a random sample of 5,000 individuals revealed that 68% expressed belief that American democratic capitalism was economically superior to German fascist autarky. 54% expressed willingness to support democratic government in post-war Germany. And 41% explicitly stated that Nazi ideology had been based on false premises about the relationship between race, willpower, and industrial productivity. These results represent a dramatic shift in attitudes compared to surveys conducted in 1943 and suggest that material evidence is more persuasive than rhetorical argument in undermining totalitarian belief systems." The loop back to the opening symbol came on September 14, 1946, when the last group of prisoners from Camp Concordia was processed for repatriation to Germany. Hartmann stood at the same fence line where he had watched an American soldier throw away half a loaf of bread 3 years earlier. But now the wire was being taken down section by section, rolled into bundles and loaded onto trucks. The camp being decommissioned as the prisoner population dwindled from thousands to hundreds to dozens. He had been in America for 3 years and 4 months. He had learned English. He had worked on farms and in factories. He had been paid for his labor. He had eaten better than he had in Germany. He had read books that were banned in his homeland. He had seen cities that were not bombed. He had watched assembly lines produce trucks faster than he could count them. And now he was going home to a country that existed only in fragments, divided into occupation zones, its cities in ruins, its economy shattered, its population starving and cold and waiting for the next shipment of American wheat. The bread smell was still there, drifting from the camp kitchen where the cooks were preparing the final meals for the remaining prisoners. Hartmann watched a young private, not the same one from 1945, but similar, young and healthy and careless in the way that people are when they have never known deprivation, carry a trash bag to the disposal area. The bag was heavy, food waste, probably scraps that could have fed a family. It did not make Hartmann angry anymore. It made him understand something fundamental about the war he had fought and the country he had opposed. America had not defeated Germany through superior courage, or better tactics, or more ruthless leadership. America had defeated Germany by building a system so abundant that waste was economically invisible, so productive that feeding enemies was cheaper than letting them starve, so powerful that it could fight a global war while improving civilian living standards at home. Krauss approached from behind, carrying his duffel bag packed for the journey home. "Ready?" he asked. Hartmann nodded. "Ready," he said. They walked together toward the processing center where Army clerks were completing paperwork, verifying identities, issuing repatriation documents and travel vouchers and instructions for reporting to occupation authorities in Germany. Brandt was already there, standing in line with 50 other men, all of them dressed in clean American-issued clothing because their German uniforms had been destroyed or stored, and none of them wanted to wear Wehrmacht gray back into a country that had repudiated everything the uniform represented. The bus that would take them to the train station was idling in the compound yard, exhaust rising into the cool autumn air. Hartman climbed aboard and took a window seat. The bus rolled through the gate at 10:47 a.m., and for the last time he saw the guard towers and barracks and exercise yard and canteen where he had spent 3 years learning that the world was not what he had been told it was. The bus drove through Kansas farmland, past wheat fields being harvested by combines, past grain elevators rising from the prairie like concrete monuments, past farmhouses with electric lights burning in broad daylight because electricity was too cheap to meter. The train station in Concordia was small and clean. A wooden platform with a covered waiting area and a telegraph office and a Coca-Cola machine that worked when you put in a nickel. The train arrived at 2:15 p.m., a standard passenger train with comfortable seats and clean windows and a dining car serving hot meals. It would take them to New York over 3 days, crossing the continent in reverse, and from New York they would board a Liberty ship for the crossing to Bremen, where British occupation authorities would process them and release them to find their way home through a landscape they would not recognize. Hartman sat by the window and watched America scroll past. Cities intact, bridges standing, factories operating, farms producing, everything functioning in a continuous hum of industrial normality that had never stopped even while fighting the greatest war in human history. Zimmerman sat across from him, reading an American newspaper someone had left on the seat. "Says here they are opening new automobile factories in California and Michigan," Zimmerman said without looking up. "Production is expected to exceed 2 million vehicles next year. 2 million for civilians." He folded the paper and set it aside. "When we get home, if anyone asks what America was like, what do we tell them? That it was a prison camp? That we were mistreated? We can't tell them the truth because the truth sounds like capitulation. We can't tell them we ate white bread and worked 8-hour shifts and watched trucks roll off assembly lines like raindrops in a storm. They won't believe us. They will think we were brainwashed." Hartman looked out the window at a factory complex passing by, smokestacks releasing white steam, rail cars lined up at loading docks, workers visible through industrial windows. "We tell them we lost," he said quietly, "not because we were weak or cowardly or betrayed. We lost because we fought an enemy that could produce unlimited quantities of everything they needed while we were rationing bread and melting church bells for metal. We tell them the war was decided not at Stalingrad or Normandy or Berlin, but in steel mills and oil refineries and wheat fields. In factories where women welded bomber fuselages and teenagers drove forklifts and engineers designed production systems that could run for years without stopping. We tell them that willpower cannot defeat mathematics, that ideology cannot defeat logistics, that spirit cannot defeat steel." The train moved east through the afternoon, through Missouri and Illinois and Indiana, through the industrial heartland that had forged the weapons that broke the Wehrmacht and the Japanese Empire simultaneously, through a landscape of abundance so vast and so casual that it could throw away half a loaf of bread without noticing. Hartman opened his journal and wrote a final entry, dated September 14, 1946. "Leaving America today, going home to nothing, but I learned something here that I could not have learned anywhere else. Something that no amount of propaganda could have taught me and no amount of patriotic fervor could have obscured. I learned that we were not defeated by better soldiers. We were defeated by better bakers, by farmers who could waste more food than we could produce, by a system that was so rich it could afford to feed its enemies. I came here believing in German destiny. I leave believing in American capacity. That is the mathematics of defeat." The train reached New York 3 days later, pulled into Pennsylvania Station at dawn on September 17, 1946, and the prisoners disembarked into a city of 7 million people who were going about their morning commute without noticing the arrival of former enemies being escorted through the terminal toward the docks where a ship waited to take them home. Hartman walked through the station carrying his duffel bag, past newsstands selling magazines and cigarettes, past coffee shops serving breakfast, past shoeshine stands and telephone booths and everything else that made up the ordinary fabric of American life. And he thought about the loaf of bread, still warm, thrown casually into a trash barrel by a soldier who would never know that this single act of unconscious waste had done more to undermine Nazi ideology than any propaganda film or re-education lecture possibly could. It was the mathematics of abundance, and it had won the war more decisively than any bomb.